Hello, welcome. My name is Lord Hardthrasher. You may call me my lord. You have been brought before me today because YouTube has decided to show you an interesting thumbnail, or in a few cases because of specific threats that my manservant Jenkins has made towards your well-being. In either case, relax, have a nice cup of tea and something maybe a little bit stronger afterwards, and I will tell you a story. Whilst this is labelled as Part 7 in my Burma series, you are quite safe to watch this video in isolation, so to speak. Even if you haven't been infected with scrub typhus or malaria or had your first bout of dysentery yet, do not be afraid to push on. You can choose, of course, if you want to go back and watch the rest of the series, and I've assembled a helpful playlist for you if that's your desire, but right now you can continue to watch this video without fear. That said, this is a hugely complex story, comfortably the most difficult thing that I've ever tried to explain, and really one of the most confusing campaigns of the entire war. When I originally wrote this episode, it was about 23,000 words long, or to put it another way, that's nearly 3 hours of video, and I thought, you know what, we live in an era when the average person has the attention span of an ice cream in an oven. Maybe we need to cut this up a tiny bit. So I've decided to break this into 3 parts. Today we will cover the careful planning cycles that occurred in 1943 and early 1944. In point of fact, both the Japanese and the British had set a series of heffalump traps that they thought would ensnare their opponents and destroy them. We'll talk about exactly who and what and how the Indian National Army, or the Azad Hind, came to be, and explain what became of it, and why we're not going to talk about them too much thereafter, which I'm sure will add to my popularity on the subcontinent. My next episode will then look at the fight and how it started and how everything went tits up for pretty much everybody almost immediately. And then in the third and final part of this miniseries, we will focus primarily on the siege of Kohima, the battles around Imphal, and then the aftermath, which should take us through to the end of December 1944. I then plan, for the masochists amongst you, to stitch all 3 of those parts into one super long mega mare cut for the true aficionado. But for the old hands and the newbies amongst us, it would probably help if we start today's episode with a bit of an overview on what the whole front looked like in early March 1944 as these moves began to unfold. The largest army anywhere near the Burma front was, of course, that in China. It had something like 240 divisions, and the Chinese army could have been, and perhaps should have been, the decisive factor in the east, but it wasn't. Its leader, Chiang Kai-shek, spent most of the war doing the hokey-cokey, putting his left division in, taking his left division out, in, out, shaking Stilwell all about. By September 1943, all Joseph Stilwell's Northern Combat Area Command, or NCAC, had from Chiang was 2 Chinese divisions and a group of Americans to train them. But when your Supreme Commander is discussing in his outdoor voice what a shame it would be if you had a terrible accident, it is probably time to make yourself scarce. To that end, Vinegar Joe had begun by trying to advance his way down the Hukong Valley in an attempt to open up the road from Lido in India to China, starting on paper with the capture of the area around Kaoming. Still had been continually let down by Shek's constant commitment and decommitment to the offensive, and had really had enough of trying to play politics, so he trained the Chinese as best he could and set off. In this, he'd been helped by the addition in early 1944 of the 5307th Composite Force, also known as Merrill's Marauders. These mad lads had originally been supposed to be part of Ord Wingate's Chindits, but Joe had refused permission for them to be trained by the British, so they'd sort of got on with it themselves, carving a furrow of VD, dead cattle and mysteriously disappearing valuables across northern India on their way to the front. In fact, Stilwell's ambition was far greater than he told anybody, well, anybody except for Slim. He wanted to drive on to capture a place called Michkina, which he referred to as Mich, on the Chinese border, for which he needed forces to continually loop around enemy positions, and the Marauders were it. If he could capture Mich, it would provide a much-needed stopping-off point for aircraft otherwise forced to fly over the hump of the Himalayas, taking supplies to Shek's armies. But as importantly, it would also be an American-led victory, not a British one, something that Joe was super keen on. Nonetheless, Joe had generously allowed, after much grumbling and groaning, to let the Chindits drop into the Indore Rail Valley to disrupt Japanese attempts to reinforce the front facing his troops in what was called Operation Thursday, which we covered in previous episodes, and you can go back and find those on this channel. This drive started in earnest, really, in February 1944, but for the next 3 episodes we're really going to leave the Americans and the Chinese slogging their way down the valley, except to note that their main supply base, without which they could not operate, was in Lido, in India. The British, meanwhile, had 2 primary fronts to worry about. Last episode we looked at the second Arakan offensive and the fight around the admin box, which was won by the end of February, and left 5th and 7th Indian Divisions, which comprised 15th Corps under the dynamic Philip Christensen, attacking the remaining fortifications along the Mondor-Butitang road. Having decisively defeated the cream of the 28th Army, they were somewhat depleted. The fight around the admin box had cost about 2,500 killed and wounded and had been a serious strain on all of the men involved. They were in need of rest and a refit. The plan was to do a bit of force rotation. 5th and 7th would go back to Chittagong and be replaced by the 26th Division, who were basically in place already, having fought their way down to relieve 5th and 7th during the admin box battle, and 36th, who were currently stationed in Chittagong acting as reserves. But it was in the north where the real focus for Slim and 14th Army lay. To get supplies up to his front was a gargantuan exercise in logistics. Landing in either Bombay on the west coast or Calcutta in the east, all supplies provided by the United Kingdom or the United States, including rations and tanks and rum and parachutes, replacement troops, rifles, ammunition, explosive, bombs, fuel, and all the other crap that you need to fight a war with, then went on a Homeric journey to the troops. Offloaded at the dockside, everything was put onto broad-gauge railways and pushed up country, where the Brahmaputra River kind of got in the way. And by in the way, the Brahmaputra ships more water than any other river in the world except for the Amazon. Bridging it was simply beyond engineering skills of the 1940s. Moreover, train lines beyond the Brahmaputra were there to shift tea high up into the hills and back, and were thus narrow gauge. So each train had to be unloaded by hand, reloaded onto narrow gauge carriages, which were then ferried over the river a dozen at a time before reforming on the other side and being hauled up to Dimapur. If the supplies were destined for Stilwell or for China, then they continued by train to the foothills of the Himalayas and the town of Lido we mentioned a moment ago. If, on the other hand, the supplies were for the British, then they were offloaded at Dimapur onto trucks and jeeps and pushed down the road heading south, which the Indian Army had built along with 30,000 labourers in 1943. This was the single most strategically important road anywhere in the region, arguably, at that moment, anywhere in the world. Starting at Dimapur, it snaked its way upwards 40-odd miles east-southeast to Kohima, which jutted out like a shield from the Dimapur base, before descending another 100-odd miles down into the plains around Imphal. From there it split going southeast to the border town of Tamu in the Kabul Valley, or going south-southwest into Burma to the town of Tidim. In each of these towns there were divisions of Slim's 14th Army covering them. At Tidim was Punch Cowan's 17th Indian Division covering the Chin Hills and fighting increasingly effective actions against Japanese probes. Cowan had been in command of the division since the outbreak of the war with the Japanese, and he and his troops were veterans of the retreat from Burma, and they represented one of the finest fighting forces in 14th Army in February 1944. At Tamu, Douglas Gracie commanded the 20th Division. Gracie had one of the most difficult jobs in 14th Army, as he had to cover the entrance to the Chin Hills behind him and controlled a sector that went all the way down to the Chindwin River, effectively creating a kind of no man's land where both British and Japanese forces attempted to out-patrol one another. To help him, he had significant numbers of V-forced scouts, mostly local tribespeople and former planters, watching every track and pass that they could and reporting back to him anything that moved. Well, anything they saw that moved. 60 miles back up the road at Imphal was 23rd Division under the wonderfully named Uvri Roberts, which honestly sounds like a kind of pudding, but was in fact a very competent chap whose role was to support 17th and 20th in the event that they got into a fight, as well as protecting Imphal town itself. Together these three divisions, 17th, 20th and 23rd, comprised 4th Corps under Geoffrey Scoones and were the backbone of the defence of India in 1944, and also the kernel from which Slim planned to take the offensive. All along this route was a series of airfields there to support the rapid transit of troops in and out of the front line, as well as moving supplies around. But really the key airfields were around Imphal, and for good reason, and we will come back to that in a minute. The challenge for Slim and Scoones was the sheer scale of this front and its nightmarish topography. In linear terms, 4th Corps was trying to cover a line about 700 miles long along this road, but when you add the depth to the Chindwin in, suddenly that's about 16,000 square miles of hills, rivers, pathways, jeep tracks, passes, paddy and plain to cover and protect against incursions. The truth was that in a space like this it was really only comparable with the Eastern Front in 1944, and they couldn't be strong everywhere with relatively limited resources to hand. Scoones decided to make the absolutely classic mistake of labelling large areas of this ground as impassable. And honestly, we've been at this Burma business for a while now. Literally anytime anyone says it's impassable, don't worry about those hills, I get the urge to scream at them, to immediately open fire with all the artillery at hand. Given the Japanese penchant for appearing behind you like some weirdo uncle your parents parents warn you about. This wasn't a brilliant decision by Scoones. But I kind of get it, given just how utterly vital the road was. Instead, he decided that the Japanese would definitely come from the south and definitely use the road, because they'd literally never done that before in any of their campaigns. But hey, third time's a charm, right? Okay, that's a pretty good overview of the fronts and where everybody sat at the beginning of 1944. Let's talk about what they were planning to do to one another. There are moments in one's life where something is happening to you that is so completely bloody bizarre, you sort of stagger backwards out of yourself in a moment of vertigo and think, how in the name of all that is holy did I wind up here? In December of 1943, Colonel Nishiro Susumu of the Military Affairs Section of the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo had such a moment. He was briefing the most powerful man in Japan, aside from the Emperor himself, on what the Imperial General Staff confidently predicted would be the killer blow for the British and the turning point of the war in Southeast Asia. This job was not an easy one, and made no easier because as he did so, Tojo stood before him stark bollock naked, buffing his genitals with a large white fluffy towel. However, the colonel was a courageous and loyal servant of the Emperor, and he'd spent 3 days being briefed for this crucial mission. Towel or no towel, clothes or no clothes, he was not going to cock there to mess this up. And so it was that the Japanese offensives of Hago and Yugo were given the big the big tick. The situation for the Japanese in December of 1943 was pretty stark. Everyone knew it and no one could admit it. The Navy had had their back broken at Midway. The first land defeat the Imperial Japanese Army had ever admitted to had happened at the hands of the Australians at Milner Bay and was rapidly followed by American-led defeats on New Guinea. And just the previous month, America had captured the island of Tarawa. Each of these defeats was explicable in and of itself, but each had been a hammer blow to Japanese pride and their sense of invincibility. It did not take a genius of Yamamoto's grade to realise that the Americans would continue to push across the Pacific inch by inch. China was a bloody quagmire. There were over 1 million men committed and so little to show for it, no one quite knew what to do. But in Burma, or more exactly in India, maybe there was a way forward against the weak and pathetic Commonwealth forces there. In March of 1943, 15th Army had been given a new commanding officer, the 55-year-old Lieutenant General Mutoguchi Reina. He was a man, or so he claimed, largely responsible for the Marco Polo Bridge incident, which had triggered the Second Sino-Japanese War back in 1937, a fact about which he boasted constantly. A borderline alcoholic, which was something of an occupational hazard amongst senior Japanese generals, he was hugely ambitious, loud, boorish, and without any self-doubt. This was probably just as well because his principal commanders, Yanagida Motozo, Yamauchi Masafumi, and Sato Kotoku, all used words like moron, blockhead, and unfit for command when talking about him. We in the West often think of the Japanese society as being very hierarchical, which it is, but in the Japanese military of the 1930s and 40s, senior commanders spent at least as much time stabbing one another in the back as they did the enemy, often quite literally. Mutoguchi had his flaws, for sure, slapping staff officers, having one of them arrested by the Kampei Tai for insubordination, and having anyone who questioned him reposted to the shittest job he could find. But whilst his principal commanders might have assumed Mutoguchi to have the intellectual horsepower of a futon mattress, he actually possessed a shrewd understanding of just how to push the buttons of his superiors and to get things to go his way, and he also possessed a driving ambition for glory. Mutoguchi knew that Burma was a backwater. He also knew that that meant that any glorious large-scale offensive by his forces would be unlikely to get signed off. So what he needed was a clever bit of circular logic to get things going. Everyone knows that attack is the best form of defence, right? Therefore, he would try and sell his plan as a defensive battle, just, a few hundred miles from his current position. And the whole eternal glory thing? Oh, well, that wasn't important to this humble servant of the Emperor. Flawless logic there. But the pitch had to be considerably more subtle than just that. Anything that looked too innovative would be rejected out of hand. The Japanese military was obsessed with reusing items from the past, not coming up with new ideas, often with tragic consequences, as we'll see. He needed to present his plan not as something new, but as instead as an evolution of an existing plan. Fortunately, he had the perfect cover here. Back in the middle of 1942, when the British had been thrown out of Burma initially, the General Staff had cooked up a pursuit plan to kick on into India and to chase the British back as far as Calcutta, codenamed Plan 21. Mutaguchi had been asked to comment on this at the time, so he and his staff had examined the possibilities. In the end, they'd done basically what everybody in this region had always done for hundreds of years. They looked up at the massive Naga hills, the malarial valleys, the lack of roads, and then back at the delightful summer capital of Myanmar with its pretty girls, hot and cold running sake, and decided on reflection that they had other priorities than dying of malaria and gas gangrene right now. However, Ord Wingate and his merry men had then yomped over those apparently impassable hills, fully armed and fully a pain in the arse, and they'd managed to make everybody in the Japanese High Command look a bit stupid. Whilst torturing to death the prisoners that they'd captured had made themselves feel a bit better, the ignominy of what had happened spurred Mutaguchi to serious planning. After all, if the feeble and weak Duke forces could do it, then by God the Japanese could do it better and bigger. This meant that Mutaguchi could pitch everything both as a recovery of face for the Chindit operation and as an evolution of Plan 21, not as something new. The plan he and his remaining staff created was divided into two parts. The first part, Operation Z, or Hargo, we looked at last episode, and it was designed to be a stab in the south. Its primary goal was to suck British resources south, away from Imphal, and it had the added potential that if it somehow worked, then Japanese forces might be able to seize Chittagong. However, the main event was codenamed Operation U-Go, or Operation C, and this would be a massive strike to the northern front about 3 weeks later, using the whole of 15th Army, as well as numerous attached units. There'd be 3 key strategic strikes, one at Tiddim and Tamu, one at Imphal, and one at Kohima, each carefully timed and weighted to cause maximum confusion in amongst the British. Since it was logical for the British to expect a blow from the southern end of the road towards Tiddim and Tamu, Mutaguchi planned to comply with British expectations, initially with a thrust by elements of 33rd Division, led by Lieutenant General Yanagida Mozoto. He would divide his forces, as per bloody usual for pretty much every Japanese plan, into 2. One column would advance to take Tamu, where it would engage and destroy 20th Indian Division, whilst his right-hand man, Major General Yamamoto, would strike 17th Indian Division at Tiddim about a week later. These attacks would draw any remaining British reinforcements southwards away from Imphal. Mutaguchi would then launch 2 further attacks, timed to land as the British were all stretched out on the road. Lieutenant General Yamamuchi Masafumo would take the bulk of his 15th Division over the mountains and the Samora Tract to Sangshat, and then head west to attack Imphal from the north. Meanwhile, ideally simultaneously, Lieutenant General Sato Kokotu would take the bulk of 31st Division, roughly 20,000 strong, across the Chindwin between Hamul and Tamathai and envelop Kohima. These fingers would then close into a fist, crushing the entire 14th Army in India, securing a defensive front that would destroy both the American operations to support China and the British offensive capability into Burma. At least, this was the plan he submitted and said out loud. But Mutaguchi Reina wanted to be a hero, not a holder of defensive positions. He reckoned that if he got the better part of 3 armies that he had on hand into northern India, then why stop there? Why not take Dimapur? And if you got the supply dumps at Dimapur, then really, why not try and take India as a whole? I mean, to anyone with half a brain cell, there are actually lots of reasons. To a dispassionate mind, what Mutaguchi was actually proposing here was to take a large body of men, desperately needed on other fronts, put them in the extreme end of Japan's very limited supply lines, and then push them hundreds and hundreds of miles further into a country which really was of no strategic interest to Japan at all. But to Mutaguchi, such griping sounded a lot like other people's problems. Over the second half of 1943, he refined his plans, fired anyone who questioned his orders, and worked up bringing the necessary forces into Burma. All that remained was to get permission from the top. For all of Mutaguchi's bluster and glory hunting, he knew how to fire up the Japanese Imperial Army General Staff. To understand just how the hell he managed to get this clearly nonsensical plan off the ground, you and I must don our overalls, lie on our backs on one of those weird trolley things with the wheels on it, and look at the underside of the IJA's cultural engine. Firstly, the idea of wetting one's sword in the blood of one's enemies was critical to Japanese imperial thinking at really all levels of the armed forces. And I don't just mean that figuratively, it was literally more honourable to use a sword on an enemy than anything else. Deep in Japanese culture was the idea that guns were necessary, but still somehow lesser, or maybe even cowardly. Ever looked at a group of Japanese troops in a picture or a film? Notice how they always have their bayonets fixed. This is why. Watch as we go through this. Whenever I put officers on the screen, you'll see that they carry swords, not rifles or machine guns like their Western counterparts. This is why. Look at the Japanese Type 96 light machine gun, for goodness sakes, and note they fitted goddamn bayonet lugs on them. That's because they were going to push them to the front line. You don't get that on an MG42. At a less literal but no less important level, it meant that when the Army High Command was offered a plan which proposed to attack the enemy, basically for the sake of attacking the enemy, they didn't stop to seriously question the strategic purpose, because the offensive was the purpose of the offensive. Justifications could be worked out after the fact. On top of this, the concepts of face and honour added further weight. Momentum built up at each stage of the plan's presentation to the successive layers of senior commanders. Each of them, in turn, risked losing face if they said no. They might look like cowards, undeserving of their position or authority, compared to the thrusting younger man below offering a vision of victory. And thus the pressure built on their superiors to continually avoid saying no. There was then, of course, an added urgency to approving the plan. With the Australians and the Yanks beginning to smack the Japanese armed forces around the ring on a regular basis, many within the Japanese High Command had a bit of a sinking feeling about what might happen next. The British, Indians, Aussies and Americans had not, as expected, surrendered after suffering the brutal blows of the opening phase of the war. An offensive now tacitly suggested, despite the practical problems, that Japan could still win, something that everybody in Japanese High Command simply had to believe was true. If not, then all of this was pointless, and, well, that wasn't worth saying out loud. I mean, not least because the Kempeitai were likely to arrest you and your family and torture you all to death if you did so, but you get the idea. Therefore, when General Mutaguchi Reina presented his plans to his immediate boss, General Kawabe Masasaku, the Burma Area Army Commander, Kawabe was, despite his initial skepticism, rapidly won round, writing in his diary, "I love this man's enthusiasm. You can't help admiring his almost religious fervour." Between the two of them, they began to bring in reinforcements to Burma, pulling troops from Malaya, Java, the Pacific and Thailand, until there were 7 divisions, plus an entire air division, available for operations against an estimated Duke strength of 5. First hurdle down, Mutaguchi now worked on going higher up the tree. Kawabe sponsored the plan to his boss, Field Marshal Terauchi of the Southern Area Command in Saigon. Terauchi felt, with 2 of his subordinates showing aggression and pride, and with significant forces now arrayed in Burma, it would be difficult for him to refuse permission to proceed. He therefore called a 4-day planning meeting in Rangoon, which included representatives from the Imperial General Staff headquarters as well as the Emperor's brother, Prince Takanida, perhaps hoping that these men could turn it down as a collective. Where one man might lose face, a group with a collective decision might stand a better chance. But Mutaguchi wasn't done yet. Groups are funny things, especially when wrapped up in honour and face, and Mutaguchi figured that whilst they might feel they could say no to one thing, if he carefully pitched it and put forward his idea, they might feel uncomfortable saying no to 2 things in a row. Moreover, as we discussed a minute ago, if he made it look like this plan was not in fact new, but something that they'd already said yes to, he could probably get the go-ahead. Never being one to shy away from a gamble, on day 1 of the planning conference, Mutaguchi put forward a frankly ludicrous opening suggestion for a full-on invasion of India, which he knew would be refused, and it was duly turned down. Then on day 2, he put forward not a concept for discussion, but a carefully worked out and fully staffed plan for Hago and Ugo, pitching it as a minor evolution of Plan 21, a plan that they had already said that they liked and approved back in 1942, but had lacked the resources to execute. Now they had those resources on hand. This was catnip to the assembled generals. Organisational culture and momentum do strange things if not checked, and they often do them without anybody in the room even noticing what's happening. It's partly how, the Russian military spent millions on a stealth fighter that isn't stealthy and a tank that can't tank, or the CEO of eBay wound up sending an elderly couple in Boston anonymous boxes of spiders and pig fetuses. By the time Tojo got around to drying his D in front of Colonel Nishiruru, the organisational momentum and cultural norms meant that all that Tojo could really do was blow-dry his pubes and ask a few questions before saying yes. And thus it was that Mutaguchi Reina's merry men would get to go on an awfully big adventure into the hills in India. But he wouldn't be going alone. Let us turn to consider the Indians who would be helping to invade India with him. After the successes of 1942, it didn't take long for the Japanese High Command to realise that the tens of thousands of captured Indian troops from Malaya, Hong Kong and Singapore might prove a useful tool with which to menace the British in India. After all, they reasoned, the Indian army had to have as many people in favour of its independence as the rest of India, which was going through convulsions under Gandhi's Quit India campaign. Probably, they also reasoned, Indian troops would be quite keen on not being worked to death in horrific prisoner-of-war camps too. Win-win. All that was needed was a charismatic voice to win over the doubters. Therefore, when a young captain named Mohan Singh was captured by Japanese officers and offered to set up for them the Indian National Army, or INA, he was talking to a receptive crowd. After a lot of backroom politics, which we can basically skip here, Singh addressed a crowd of captured Indian troops in Singapore at a place called Farrer Park on the 17th of February 1942 and announced the formation of the INA formally. The prisoners were offered the chance to join up and overthrow the British with their new Japanese friends. And over the following 8 months or so, something like half of all Indian troops captured, about 40,000, signed up for service with the INA, ready to fight for independence and controlled freedom. All very rousing stuff. In what would become something of a pattern for INA-Japanese relationships, there then followed something of a bloodbath that tends to get forgotten. The other 50% who elected to stick to their salt and not join up to fight for the fascists discovered just how close the bonds of Asian brotherhood were when their friends in the IJA marched them off to be shot or worked to death on various infrastructure projects. Their survival rates were about the same as those of Soviet prisoners of the Nazis. Less than 10% emerged alive in 1945. Still, you can't make an omelette without killing 40,000 of your countrymen, eh? So onwards went Singh. He established a force along what he saw as good Congress lines. That meant mixed messing for the men, Hindu and Muslim troops serving in the same units, a complete political wing on the organisation, and so on and so on and so on, none of which was really what the Japanese were after. Things got complicated, as they often do in revolutionary causes, and after a lot of important-sounding political meetings attended by folks with important-sounding jobs and ranks that they'd awarded themselves, the Japanese decided that actually, on reflection, what was really important here was for the Japanese to be in charge. Having rebels, even ones that were nominally loyal to them, might prove to be bloody dangerous. So they shut the whole thing down, arrested Singh, disbanded the INA, and put the men back into the horrific camp system. So that went well. Having got rid of Singh, and now with quite the political mess on their hands, the Japanese needed somebody to come in and at least kind of front up something that they could call the government in exile. This would lend the Japanese a great deal of legitimacy for their Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. They could, of course, have tried to turn to Gandhi, but he'd been arrested and imprisoned by the British at this point. But really, they needed somebody under their control, someone a little less peace, love and poverty, and a bit more nice uniforms, armed struggle looks good in propaganda shots. Fortunately, their close pal Adolf Hitler had just such a man stashed away in Berlin who fitted the bill perfectly. Enter stage right then a chap called Subhas Chandra Bose, former Congress Party member, opponent of Gandhi, and advocate for the violent overthrow of British rule in India. Now, this will upset some of my Indian friends, but Bose was an utter git and a wannabe fascist. Originally a Democrat, he came to believe that a strong man was needed for India, a dictatorship, under some strong and charismatic leader. Some leader like Subhas Chandra Bose, now you mention it. He believed in an amalgam of communism, fascism, and the ideas from the Bhagavad Gita was an ideal thing for the Indian nation, developing what we can only really call a uniquely Indian version of religious fascism. Bose felt it was absolutely vital for Indian blood to be spilt in the violent struggle for independence. That, and I quote, "It is our duty to pay for our liberty with our own blood. It is blood alone that can pay the price for freedom in our land. Give me blood and I will give you freedom." Now, put it a different way, the land of India needed to be reclaimed by the spilling of Indian blood, which, okay, look, this is basically Nazi blood and soil shit right here. Having fallen out with Gandhi in India, Bose needed to go somewhere which was more in line with his beliefs, that somewhere being Berlin in 1941. There he had tried to raise an Indian army from POWs taken by the Germans in North Africa with a view to using them to invade India from, well, probably Egypt, I guess. Interestingly, it was here that Bose began to use a bit of local corporate branding and the Monkia Netaji, or respected leader, and I'm sure it was an idea that just came to him in a dream. Anyway, Bose met with some success, creating something called the Free India Legion. Turned out, though, that most Indian troops didn't really want to work for the Nazis because, it was possible that the Nazis might have been just a tiny bit racist. And then El Alamein happened, and the Nazis really lost all interest in trying to support an invasion of India. Bose was put on a U-boat and then a Japanese sub and transported to Tokyo, arriving in 1943. Proclaiming, with Japanese approval, the Azad Hind, the Free Indian government in October. This is actually the second time that he'd done that. Bose secured the backing of Tojo for using a new, much smaller INA to help invade British India. The idea, according to Bose, was that the use of Indian troops would cause a revolution within India itself, and it would take the country by storm. His timing was perfect because just as he was shopping the idea around, Mutaguchi's plan to invade India arrived in Tojo's bathroom. Seeing political benefits to including the INA in the plan, not least because it allowed them to once again claim just cause for an act of naked aggression, the attempt to invade India was rebranded as the Chhaut Delhi, or the March on Delhi. After much wrangling, it was decided that about 6,000 Indian troops would take part in Mutaguchi's operations, and that another 10,000 could be raised from POW camps for future operations in India. At the risk of spoilers, this did not end well for them. Their propaganda convinced many of the advancing disciples of Netaji that their fellow Indians would refuse to fire on them, that there would be a mass uprising and easy victories. Consequently, many threw away heavier items like mortars and machine guns and ammunition for the long march from the Chindwin. They assumed that the Japanese would provide them with food and anti-malarial drugs, as the British had done, but this was often not forthcoming. Disease and starvation thinned their ranks even faster than combat. 2nd Gandhi Regiment started with about 3,000 troops in late March. A month later, 30% were dead, deserted, or had been captured. In fact, of the 6,000 men of the INA who marched into India in March of 1944, barely 2,500 would return. 400 were killed in battle, 1,500 died of disease, 800 deserted, and 750 were captured by July. These statistics caused a complete loss of faith in the INA as a military force, both within their own ranks and by the Japanese, and whilst some would continue to fight bravely, it was clear that their cause was lost. By the end of January 1944, it was increasingly clear to General William Slim that the Japanese were coming in strength and soon. Reinforcements tracked through a combination of monitoring radio stations and broken codes were pouring into Burma from Siam, the Pacific and China. River traffic on the Chindwin was picking up, seen from the air and reported by V-Force scouts on the ground. Estimates made by British intelligence, which subsequently proved to be remarkably accurate, suggested that the total number of Japanese forces in Burma had gone from approximately 150,000 in mid-1942 to somewhere around 350,000 at the end of 1943. Japanese infiltration parties had been ambushed by 17th Indian Division on the Chin Hills with maps of Assam on them. It was reported that small groups of Japanese reconnaissance troops had been seen in and around villages up and down the Chindwin River Valley, mostly in the south. At some point, the Eastern Wireless Signal Centre in Barrackpore, part of the euphemistically titled Intelligence School C, in fact actually part of Bletchley Park's Indian operations, got a firm confirmation that there would indeed be a Japanese attack. In fact, they got a date too. The 15th of March, 1944. This was passed up the chain to Slim via the MI6 Special Liaison Unit attached to his HQ in Camilla, and as it turned out, was exactly what Slim had been hoping to hear. Slim understood something that eluded many other commanders faced with very large fronts in places like China and the Soviet Union. Physically holding territory for the sake of holding territory was utterly pointless. There weren't towns here like Paris or Rome or Moscow, just villages that no one had ever heard of, which showed up as specks on a staff map in an army HQ and meant nothing to the troops or to the political situation. He therefore resolved, as far back as the retreat through Burma in 1942, to regard lost ground and gained ground only as important if it allowed him to get to grips with the enemy. The point was to fight and kill Japanese, not to worry about who owned what speck of a village. This realisation in turn allowed him to look at places that he could lure the Japanese to and kill them without getting hung up on whether he or his enemy was advancing. He could hold the initiative whether he was going forwards or backwards. Most generals, and I'd hazard to say all Nazi generals and all Japanese generals at any rate, would have been tempted to throw their armies forward to dive into Burma. Indeed, this was exactly what many in London and Washington assumed Slim would do. But as Slim put it, I was tired of fighting the Japanese where they had good lines of communications behind them and I had execrable ones. This time I would reverse the procedure. If he fought hundreds of miles beyond his bases, over those damned hills, with just the resources that he had on hand, then the outcome would be uncertain at best and probably disastrous. By contrast, fight close to his bases, and especially his airfields, and his supply lines would be short, whilst his enemies would be near breaking. And hearing that Mutaguchi wanted to take his summer holidays in India in 1944, Slim felt an appropriate welcoming party would be in order. It would entail some risks. Fights like this always do. The trick was going to be to get the Japanese to come deep into Assam, overextend themselves, move beyond their supply lines, beyond their air cover, stringing themselves out along roads and pathways, dilute their numbers with territory, and as this was happening, bring his own forces together, concentrate them, and then turn and destroy his enemy. He therefore proposed a plan, approved by both Gifford and Mountbatten, to withdraw his units up from Tiddim and Tamu and bring them together at Imphal the moment that the Japanese appeared. This would allow them to fight around 4th Corps HQ, where they could create redoubts around 6 key airfields, thus securing their own supply lines and being able to fight on a plain, where they could move around more easily than the Japanese. The Japanese would see the British as retreating, which would be what they expected to do, and would pursue them headlong, regardless of risk. With 5th and 7th Indian Divisions already preparing to rotate out of the Arakan, he proposed taking the victors of the admin box, that is the 7th Division, and fly the whole thing to Imphal at the critical moment, creating an overwhelming force at the key point of pressure. To make absolutely sure, he prepared to move the British 2nd Division into Chittagong, ready to either move north to support the fight around Imphal, or to go south. Because part of Slim's plan here was, of course, to keep the offensive in the Arakan going and continue to apply pressure to the Japanese 28th Army, potentially forcing Kawabe to order forces away from the Imphal, just as Mutaguchi had planned to use the Arakan to draw British reinforcements away from Imphal when he attacked. And of course, both the American-led NCAC and the Chindits would continue to put pressure on the Japanese in the north and across their supply lines. It was a bold plan, not least because the Americans absolutely bloody hated it. Al Wendermeyer, Mountbatten's Deputy Chief of Staff, and a man who really should have known better, frankly, briefed Washington in July, as these battles were being fought, that Slim was yellow and just trying to hold the Japanese until the monsoon. And he got this information from other US units in, hang on, let me check my notes here. Oh yes, Joe fucking Stilwell's headquarters, and they got it out of their fucking arses yet again. In point of fact, this was a really, really smart plan. It used all the best bits of the British capability here, from logistical strength and combined arms training to the territory itself, whilst playing against Japanese weaknesses. The critical bit was moving 17th Division out of Tidim and 20th Division out of Tamu in time to avoid them getting bogged down in contact with the enemy and avoid causing morale problems when he ordered a withdrawal to new positions. Slim gave the decision of when to make that move to 4th Corps Commander Geoffrey Scoones and told him to brief his divisional commanders so that they could decide when to withdraw. This actually, as it turned out, was a huge mistake. The other thing it banked on was a relatively light Japanese penetration of the Naga Hills, not, say, 2 entire divisions kicking the door in around Imphal and Kohima. And so it was that Mutaguchi and Slim were both going to do what the other expected, but not quite the way that they expected them to do it. And thus a front which was a mass of traps and counter-traps would, as we are about to see next time, not really work the way anybody expected it to.